It's afternoon, and so we are going to jump into our session today because if you've attended previous sessions, you know that I struggle to get us to that Q&A portion with lots of time. And today is probably going to be no different because there is a lot of info that I want to offer you, particularly because this is sort of the question that every parent of grieving kids is asking. So we want to give a lot of space to this. This is a really important topic. So I'm going to offer some ideas, a lot of information. You may want to go back and rewatch. You also just might want to pay attention to grabbing the pieces that really connect for you. So you're not going to remember everything here. Just notice, and we'll have some time at the end to reflect on what were the takeaways for you. And you're not going to remember all of these things. We'll check in at a certain point, just like I would with you if we were in the office having this conversation one-on-one. Just check in with you halfway through, maybe at some point, to see how you're doing. So let's move into our topic today. What's grief and what's not? And I use this image to say it's like the $1 million question every parent is asking. I think that really the question, usually the way it comes to us, is what's grief and what's behavior? What's just bad behavior and what's my child's grief? So we're gonna explore that topic today. I want to invite you to use the chat if you want. It feels like this group that shows up, some of you come each time, some of you pop into the sessions that you're needing for Lunch and Learn. But my sense is that what you're really needing is just the purpose of the Lunch and Learn, that direct, concrete information. You're taking it in, you're thinking about it, applying it outside of this session. But if you do have questions coming up, comments coming up, connections that you're making, this is a community of parents who are, walking a similar journey as you. So even putting the question out, sharing some of your experience is really valuable for others to be able to hear and receive as well. I want to encourage you to do that because we may come speeding into the end of our time and there may not be a giant chunk for question and answers. So please, please, please feel free to use the chat to do that. Sophie's here with us and she's going to add some resources in the chat for you. Again, lots of information today. And so I have included quite a few resources. If some of these things are really catching you or they're really relevant to you, to your family, there's going to be some links there that you can go deeper with these things. And so, yeah, invite you to kind of keep your chat open, maybe click on those links, save them for later when the session is over. Okay. When parents ask that $1 million question, I hear another question below the question. And it is usually something like this. Like, how do I support? What are the right ways to go about recognizing that my child, my teen is experiencing grief and the overwhelm that often comes with that, and still feeling permission, capable, able to have expectations and set limits? So how do I approach them with care, compassion, and understanding that they are grieving, but also be able to have boundaries and set limits and have rules? So that's, I think, the question underneath the question, and that's the one we're going to talk about today. Okay, I love this cartoon that I discovered from Lives in the Balance. I hope you pick up on this today, that one of the things I'm going to offer you might be a different lens to look at that bad behavior. So that's what's happening here. As you can see, one actually quite small lens. It's very narrow, looks like manipulation. The other one, bigger lens, little higher perspective, even maybe on that step stool, can say, oh, wow, this is a different perspective. There might be some lacking skills here. Okay. I want to offer you, this is something that I just want to highlight for you. We're going to come back to it. I also think, as you know, if you've attended a Lunch and Learn before, that we have one more session at the end of April that is still sort of to be determined. What does this group of parents need from us? And I think this may be a place that we return to. This is based on the research of someone named Erwin Sandler out of Arizona State University. And he and his colleagues have done 25 years of research and practice around what they have called resilient parenting for grievers. So it's really specific toward you as a parent who's grieving, who's parenting grieving kids. And these are the elements. These are sort of the building blocks of what the research has shown helps kids become more resilient during grief. It's this resilient parenting piece. And so today, the question, the $1 million question, if you can see my mouse moving there, is sort of in this zone, the rule zone. What's okay to do? You know, where can I set rules and limits? But I want you to take notice that it's not at the foundation, that there's some other things down here at the foundation. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Just pay attention to that. That sometimes I have 2 kids myself, and sometimes we might have the urge to slap this one on the foundation. So we're just paying attention to that there's this self-care piece that really is for you, that we know is a challenge as you're adjusting to grief yourself. But there's these other pieces here: family bonds, family ties, active listening on the part of the parent, active engagement, attunement, listening, this rules piece. And this is how we help children cope in specific ways. So just want to offer you that this is a little bit of a framework. If you're wondering, is it okay to set rules? The research shows it is. And actually, grieving kids need it. Kids need it. It provides that sense of safety and predictability. So we're going to talk about that. Okay, we got to define this word a little bit, because I said that Sandler's work is called resilient parenting. It's a model for resilient parenting, which produces resilient kids as well. What does that word mean? I think there's lots of definitions out there. And so this is the one, if you just Google, you'll find the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or tough situations, and the ability to spring back into shape. I want to challenge that idea. And certainly I wouldn't be the first. This is an old idea but when we're talking about kids, when we're talking about human beings, this isn't really what resiliency means. And especially if we're talking about grief, let me come back here, especially if we're talking about grief, let me offer you a different possibility. Resiliency is actually the process, and I've italicized that word, it's a process of adapting well in the face of stressors and adversity. So resiliency, sometimes we have this idea that kids are just innately resilient. And sometimes we say that. There is some truth to the resiliency and the developmental push toward growth that happens in children. But resiliency is not a given. It is built. It is a process that we are going to support kids in over time as they encounter and adjust to stressors. And we're going to look in this topic as grief as a stressor. So if you look here, another way of thinking about resiliency is this: challenges in our lives, stressors, equal resiliency. They produce, the process of that will produce resiliency. When we have stressful experiences, so when kids come up against, let's use grief, when they are experiencing grief, and those experiences are being mediated, are being buffered, are being encountered with a safe and supportive relationship. So the relationship part is really, really important. Stress is not bad for us. And in fact, we can't build our resiliency without it. We can't, but it's the level of stress, the amount of tolerable stress. And this is why that safe, supportive relationship is vital, critical, to check in on the levels of stress that are happening. Are they tolerable? Are they severe? Are they moderate? Are they tolerable? So we're wanting to pay attention to that. And one of the ways that we're building resiliency, participating in that process, is around limit setting, expectations for our kids, boundaries. This is a really key, valuable part. That's why they have adult brains, to share and mediate some of what they're experiencing. I think that's the main thing I want to say here, but I want to challenge that idea that resiliency is returning to our old shape. As you know, as grievers, that's not possible. We can't return to our old shape. Recently, I had a conversation with a mom, and I asked what her goals were, what her hopes were for her son coming to the Children's Grief Center for grief support. And like just wholeheartedly, she said, I want him to be able to be the person he would have been. And I totally understood that, and probably you do too. And that's not possible. That shape is going to be different now. It doesn't mean it's not a good shape or a strong shape, or he won't go on to have a really fulfilling, wonderful life, but it will not be the one that he would have had if his life had not become oriented around loss. So that is the reality of it. But how do we support our kids in this process of adapting to the new shape, to a strong shape after a death? This is one of the ways I want you to think about it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Sophie did a presentation early on. I think it's our third one, around when families grieve differently. And she did a little introduction to what is called the dual process model. But I wanted to offer it to you as well, because this is the process that kids are going through. I just said resiliency is that process that we are supporting kids through as they adjust. This is that process when it comes to grief and kids. So in here, you can see there's just the everyday life experiences occurring, and they are moving between loss and restoration, future, reconstruction of who they're becoming, finding that new shape. So this is the movement. This is the process, and we want to pay attention to it, and we want to support it. So I put in here some of the things you'll notice when we're working on the loss side, when we get moved into the loss side. We're in the process of accepting the reality of the loss, the death in our lives, the absence of our person. So this is for kids. Adults is very, very similar, but there's some differences just in the way these play out. But they're going to have intrusions of grief, and that can show up in thoughts, feelings, memories. These can be intense and these can be painful. And what I'm going to offer is that these may create some of the behavior that you see. And that's your question, right? When is grief the cause of some of the bad behavior that I'm seeing? There's these other pieces they're doing. Oh, and I see a typo. Okay, I'm going to practice self-compassion on that. Okay, but you can see this is the movement back and forth. And this is normal. This is the process. This is grieving. And over here, these are some of the things, activities, behaviors you'll see, processes you'll see as they are moving toward future restoration. I think one other piece I just wanted to add is that in childhood, there are three. You don't have to remember this, but just highlighting how this connects to resiliency and your parenting to help your kids adapt to the loss. There's three really core tasks that are connected for childhood development. One is making secure attachments, relationships, and you're a vital part of that, obviously. Two is learning how to self-regulate, how to regulate themselves as they move out into the world, as they encounter stressors. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good human development. Three is to learn how to navigate the social world and relationships with other people. And these are connected. And actually the second two, learning to self-regulate and learning how to engage with others in the world, depends on the first. And I will acknowledge that, when there is, say, the death of a parent, that is something that's part of the loss side that a child is navigating, the loss of a secure attachment, which, going back to our definition of resiliency, we want to be able to provide safe and supportive relationship, which does require for you and for them, for there to be limits, expectations. A healthy family has rules, has expectations. So maybe I should tell you that first. If that's your question, I'm not going to minimize that while we talk about where's that behavior coming from. Just want to do a little bit of defining and separating this idea of self-regulation versus self-control. Because when we see bad behavior, we'll call it that, in our kids, oftentimes we are looking at this self-control thing, and it is so frustrating. They know better. We've talked about this 50 times. And why can't they just show self-control? Why can't they just do what they're supposed to do? So I just wanted to highlight that's a real head thing. Self-control is cognitive. It's often when we're talking to our kids in that way, we're talking kind of head to head, thinking to thinking, cognitive. And we're using our reasoning, and we're hoping our reasoning is going into their head. We might be reminding them, we might be offering reflections. Remember when we said you were gonna do this? Or even just noticing things you're noticing, but it's often very verbal. And it is our thinking, trying to get their thinking to adopt our thinking, trying to get into that thinking part of our child. And the thing I want to highlight is this piece around self-regulation is really where it's at. So if you see bad behavior in your kids, what we want to say is this is in the body. Oh, giving away my secrets. This is inside the body. This is physiological. So that we want to offer a response that's also in the body that can bring regulation to a nervous system that is tipped out of its window of tolerance. Let's talk about that. But when our child is dysregulated, when their bodies are dysregulated, when they've tipped out of what's possible for them to stay calm and cool and collected and connected to you, they're not going to be able to hear any of those messages around self-control, if that makes sense. So when we're talking here about self-regulation, I want to just offer you something we've been using in our last couple of sessions, which is that metaphor, that idea of the window of tolerance. I have a link there. Sophie, if you see it, I have a link there for you. If you want to know more about this, you can look at a previous session, but you can also check out this really great YouTube video that our very own Sophie created as part of her master's program. It's honestly, this is not because Sophie made it. It is the best video on window of tolerance I've seen on YouTube. It's so clear, it's really interesting, and it's not too long. And so I encourage you to check that out if you just want a little more context to what I'm talking about. But just this idea that when we are in our window of what is tolerable, what feels comfortable, it is in that place that when our body is in that window, we are able to learn, to connect, to relax, to respond to stressors, to other people in a bit more of an adaptive way. We're able to adjust, back to our definition of resiliency. And so I want to acknowledge, as I did in our last session, that the reason I like using the window of tolerance is that we want to acknowledge that when you experience grief or your child is experiencing grief, their window is diminished and no one's done anything wrong. Just by nature of that experience, they're going to have a smaller window. The stress, if you will, we'll use that term, but the stressors that are being encountered externally in the outer world that a kid's having to deal with as a result of the death, and also internally as they're making sense of the death and the loss. And do you remember that dual process I showed you? Those movements. And then encountering the loss itself shrinks that window. So what we want to do is learn to increase that window, but we also want to recognize bad behavior is often, almost always, when a kid is tipped out of their window. Our next two sessions are going to focus a little more specifically on like what you would see when a kid is tipped out of their window by childhood and by adolescence. So if that's the thing that you'd like to know more about, join us for those. But I really just wanted to highlight this way of thinking about self-regulation versus self-control. And I said self-reg is going to be in the body to help a young person build their window and also get back into their window when they've tipped out. Is going to require the self-regulation part. Often, though, we go to the self-control messages. We try to reason. Just wanted to put this here to acknowledge the challenges of regulation when it comes to grieving. And grieving over time. Grief is lifelong. Grief is across the lifespan. Doesn't mean we don't get more skills to manage it as it comes. Doesn't mean the waves are always so intense, but it's not just the death, the absence of the person that children are often grieving, as you know. There are these other intangible pieces that come along with it. And so I think sometimes that makes it hard to know, when we think this is just bad behavior. Is this grief or is this bad behavior? I think it makes it hard to sometimes make the link because it might be some of these other things. Dad's help with math, mom's help with making decisions for the future. Thinking of clients, a person's role in joy, in finding moments of joy, creativity. I've seen that so many times. And maybe the other person was also someone who helped them regulate. That happens a lot. So now they're having to kind of shift. They've lost their footing with that. So just bearing this in mind that when you're thinking about it, it is hard sometimes to make the link. And what I'm gonna offer and challenge you to, let me come back here so I don't lose you when you look at that new slide, is that whether it's grief or whether it's bad behavior, bad behavior, in quotes, it doesn't really matter. We're going to respond to it the exact same way. So bad behavior is a cue for us as parents. Let's talk about that. How do we want to respond? Do you remember how I said we're always trying self-control? We're going in through reasoning, but we know, without going into a lot of detail, that our brains have formed from the bottom up, from lower parts to the frontal upper parts of our brain, and the reasoning part is the last thing to develop. And often the children you're talking about, your kids, don't even have their full brain structure in place. We know now, I'm sure it will change again at some point, that really our brain is not done developing, probably ever, because our brains can always change and always heal and always rewire new skills and connections. But we know really up till 25, you don't actually have all of the neural networks and brain structure that we usually think of when we think about that self-control, that making plans, impulse control, thinking about consequences. That's a really high level skill, and kids don't actually even have the brain structure fully developed for that. So this is a bottom-up approach, if you can see that. That's why I mentioned how our brains develop. So it's actually going in and meeting our young person in the place where they've actually experienced the overwhelm, the dysregulation that's moved them out of their window. So we want to help. Think of these 3 R's. If you take nothing else away from what I'm going to say today, I hope it's this. Whether it looks like bad behavior or whether it is clearly grief. We want to regulate, we want to help regulate them, come down to their level, share our nervous system with theirs. So there is a little caveat there that our own nervous system has to have some level of regulation. So this is the hard work. This is the tough stuff, really, because you're grieving too. We want to regulate, then we want to do the relating, connect with them, attune, honor, validate their experience, and then we move to reasoning. But a lot of us, myself included, I have a 14-year-old, so myself included, like to move this way. Let's go down. Actually, I sometimes think my reasoning will help them regulate, which is not true. We have to move here back to those 2 boxes of self-regulation and self-control. We want to move in through self-regulation. We want to do this co-regulating. And actually before the age around 9, of course, every child's different in their development, but around 9 is when kids are more capable of co-regulating. Prior to that, they need more external regulation from their attachment figure. And then as they develop, it shifts and they should be able to co-regulate. They should be able to self-regulate more than the parent is helping regulate them. But around 8, 9, 10, depending on a child's development and where they are on that curve, it should be expected that they might need more regulation on our part. So thinking 50-50, you wouldn't even before, the age of 8, 9, 10. So I'm gonna offer you that. Regulate, relate before we start the reasoning. I said a dysregulated parent. So if we're outside of our window of tolerance, if we've tipped out, which sometimes our kids' behavior has tipped us out, and And then if you're also a griever, your window is smaller. It is easier to get tipped out. And in our last session and in Sophie's video, it talks about we can tip out below and we can tip out above. So below we might shut down, disconnect, we might feel numbness, exhaustion, those pieces. And when we kind of go out the higher end, it might look like anger, sort of overreaction, right? An emotional overreaction. It's that fight, flight kind of side of dealing with a stressor. And so when we find ourselves tipping out, something to come back to is how are we seeing our child's behavior? So this is where I'm going to be a little bit challenging, to be honest. When I said it's not really going to matter, this comes from the work of Ross Greene, and you can see that there. And at the end, I'm going to offer you a link to more if this interests you. But how we're thinking about our child's behavior, misbehavior really matters. And so if our feeling is that they just won't do better, then it's going to lead, as you can see, kind of down that list. But if we can see that kids do well if they can, that there's no such thing as a bad kid, then maybe we can kind of reframe it and try to think about it in a different way, which can help us help our kids regulate, move inside their window. And what we want to do is be able to offer them the skills to be able to begin doing this for themselves. This is a really, really vital part of the process of helping build our kids' resiliency. So you can see, if we think, I think they can't. I think their window's so small right now. They can't do better. This behavior is, frustrating me intensely. Like, I hate it. Maybe your words are more choice and mine would be as well if I wasn't on a live lunch and learn. But, you're allowed to acknowledge that for yourself, of course, but you want to do that. But if we can be regulated ourselves, we can think maybe they can't. Then we can be curious versus being judgmental, labeling. They're lazy. They're just defiant. Maybe there are too many stressors. Some we know about, some we don't know about. Are they lacking skills somewhere to be able to cope with the stressors that they have? Likely they are. Actually, almost always they are. Can I change that? I almost never use those words. They always are. Lacking the skills to deal with what's coming. And you might be too. Like, we're human. We're human. And often we weren't raised with this either. We were raised a little bit more over here. Maybe you weren't. Maybe you were very lucky and you got a bit of this. But if we think that our kids can't, we can be more curious. We can begin to be detectives, recognize where the stressors are, what's going on, what's getting in their way. That will shape how we help and how we intervene. Then that helps us work toward, with our young person, finding and removing those barriers, solving the problems together, leading them to feel more supported and strengthened, confident, competent, right? Sometimes people say, I want my kid to have more confidence in themselves. And the only way we get that is when we get the feeling of being competent, of being able to handle what comes our way, whether that's with school or whether that's with emotions. And in this context, grief. So, and you can see the other side of that. So screenshot that if you'd like. I love this. There will be a link to his work if you want to go deeper. He offers some really interesting, concrete ways of beginning to shift into that can't side. For me, this has been a lot of work, just to be honest. It's a lot of work to shift into that, to shift my perspective, because my go-to is this other side. So what we want to do is we want to see our child from a different angle. Remember that cartoon at the beginning? Through a different lens, wider lens. That's what I'm hoping to offer you today. And then we want to be stress detectives, finding them. I don't really like the term removing them, but working with our young person to remove them, to work toward removing them together. So we want to find stressors, find ways to reduce them, figure out what are the unmet needs. Sometimes our kids' bad behavior is a very strong signal to an unmet need. And every kid is wired so differently, as you know. And so what's going to overwhelm one child won't overwhelm another child. So it's very individual. And we also want to look for the skills deficits and find ways to teach these in natural ways, also through the bottom up, through experience versus just hammering away. There's a place for that. There is a place for that cognitive teaching, as you saw. I don't want to minimize it. But that's at the top when you have a regulated in their window young person. What is our role? It's kind of a little bit of a unique graph, but I loved it to show you this. This is when a child's, often their behavior, this is what we're talking about today. What's behavior? What's grief? How do I manage it? It comes to us fiery. And sometimes it's hard to discern what's going on. It looks like defiance. It looks like disrespect. But their behavior is sending us a message. And yeah, it's coming, with more flame than we want. But our role is to be able to translate that behavior and to respond to what is underneath that. And that's the stuff I'm talking to you about, the dysregulation. What could be underneath the behavior that you're seeing? Anger. Disrespect, defiance, withdrawal. What could be under those? So this is where you are a detective. You know your child better than anyone else. But as you can see here in this image, this adult, this parent, looks pretty able to be regulated, right? So we are going to talk at the end. We'll do real talk as I do in these sessions. Let's be real about it. If a flaming ball is coming your way, you may not want to catch it with your hands, right? We may need some rules and some structure and some expectations and limits around that. We will talk about that. But this is our role, to be a detective and to pick up the cues, to pick up the messages of our kids' fiery behavior that looks, like bad behavior, and translate it and offer it back to them, checking in with them, Okay, I haven't checked the chat. Just want to, Sophie's probably putting the resources in there for me, but let me offer you one more thing before I check in with you directly. Nope, where are we going? Backward. Let's be real though. For grieving parents, the things I'm talking about, and Erwin Sandler, that research they've done for 25 years on bereaved families and resilient parenting, acknowledges this as well, that grieving families are dealing with some really unique, intense demands. And sometimes the resources you have to support yourself and your own regulation, your own coping, do not outweigh the demands on you. So you want to pay attention to this. What does this look like for you? What is the resource versus demands picture? And are there some ways to build some support into that network? We're not going to talk about it today. It's outside of the time we have. But I think this is what we'll come back to in our last session, is what can this look like? Back to the model that they have with self-care and family bonds and active listening and rules as part of that. But the base of that, the foundation of that is you and you being cared for. In the January session that'll be up online, probably by tomorrow, is about self-compassion. And I would encourage you to check it out. If you feel like self-compassion is a little bit soft, that's okay. Come to the session and maybe be open to have your mind changed a little bit. But self-compassion can be a really valuable part of that self-care. But figuring out what it is that makes this steady, as you are doing this balance between the resources that you have, the time, the energy, other demands, versus, so your resources, what you have available to you versus the demands. And you might have a kid who is harder. As I said, every kid is uniquely wired. And so some of us, the demands of one of our kids might, be really intense. And so that, kind of changes the weight of this thing as well. But this piece around your demands and resources and what's possible for you, what this looks like for you, this is the foundation for resiliency, even for your family. This is something to consider. And I forgot to say this at the start, but if you're like me and you may go to something like this session, sometimes what I do is my critic rises up, like right here, like, look at all the ways you haven't been doing this. Like, actually, he's that way because of you. Please check that. Notice that if that's part of how you show up to things like this. And I want to invite you, to pay attention to that, but that's also not the purpose of this session. It's to answer your $1 million question, help you feel like you have some skills to help them build their skills. But part of that is just noticing how we show up, acknowledging, recognizing that sometimes the demands outweigh the resources. And that is the reality. And we work to build more resources. But in the heat of the moment, when that bad behavior comes and you get pushed, our kids do this, where do you go? Where do you go to? I was sharing this with our director before we came on, and the look on her face, I couldn't quite tell what she was thinking. I don't think she'll mind me sharing this. And so I said, I go to all of these at some point sometimes, like I move all along, like, oh my gosh, And she said, okay, good. Yeah, me too. That's what I was thinking as I was looking at this slide. So I want to normalize that, validate that you're in good parent human company if you find yourself in all these. But do you find that you're more likely to move toward one or two of these more? Just noticing this, because this is how you can also, as you're building limits with your kids, you're going to need to tend to this for yourself so that you can put those expectations in place and know how to kind of back yourself up, support yourself, because you're going to get pushed. They're going to push you with these behaviors. Earlier I was trying to give you a lens into them, to the dysregulation, to them falling out of their window. And this is one where, what happens when we're falling out of our window? Where do you go? Honestly, I do all of these. Yeah. Sometimes I think it just depends on what I've been facing in my own life, where my own energy is at. How much did I have left in the beginning? Do I fall out the bottom of my window, which is over here, just give up on the structure? Fine, go. I don't even care, or withdraw into myself. You know what? I'm just going to be in my room. I'm just going to, watch Harry Potter. There's my confession. That's what I do when I need to recharge. Just withdraw. Shut down, won't communicate even maybe with them. Do you just get real hard on your boundaries? There's, or I was saying consequence overdrive. I like this one. I can do this one. When I feel absolutely pushed to my limit, and back to that reasoning, none of my reasoning seems to be going in. I throw the whole kitchen sink. That's what I do. I just start grabbing for things because I feel like nothing's working. They're not responding to anything I'm doing here. And so I find myself just kind of throwing out consequences that aren't even maybe fair. And then I have to walk that back. Okay, paying attention to that. Where do you go to? Okay, I'd love to check in with you. Sophie, do you mind putting up that poll? As I said, we're all different. So what's going on for you as we're talking about this? Number one, it's a lot of work. I want to acknowledge that. I feel that as a parent, and I'm not parenting grieving kids. So let's check your pulse here as you're listening to what I'm sharing. How are you feeling in this moment? You're like, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. This is so much work. Oh, I've got this. I feel like I've got it. I feel hopeful I can move towards some of these things. Yeah, I see for myself, I'd like to improve. Me too, I want to, but there's some things in the way for me. Feels hard. I have a sip of tea while you're reading and completing. Okay, I'm going to end that, but I'll just share that the room for improvement is most of you. Yeah, room for improvement is most of you. There's some overwhelm. You're not alone either. And there's some I'm feeling hopeful, but mostly room for improvement is sort of where most people are, which is cool in a way. I hope you feel that. That's why you're here. I want to get some skills. I want to check this out. I want to learn new ways to do this. Okay, so I want to offer you one. When pushed, I said, oopsies, where do you go? Here's what we want to do. I want to offer you this. I think there's a link. I have a link to a really great article that's not it's not boring. It's a really great article about Susan Stiffelman's work. And she uses the phrase captaining the ship. I love this one. One, because I think it's effective, and it's backed up by lots of other work that we know about child development and discipline and the need for structure and safety and security and how that produces the predictability and all of those things, the container for our kids. But I also like it because, as you know, most likely we talk about grief as it comes in waves. So I kind of like this idea of captaining the ship on the waves of grief. And so this is just, when we talked about where do you go to when you get pushed, this is thinking about, this just gives some imagery, some language around what's your go-to. And again, we probably move in between these. But our goal will really be to be the captain of the ship. And a lot of parents have said when they're talking about this $1,000,000 question, what's grief, what's behavior? But if you remember at the start, I said, what underlies that? How do I set limits? How do I have expectations for my kids? How do I keep them on a healthy track? I know that involves limits, right? Maybe feeling like unsure how to do that. So we're going to talk about that. When you find yourself doing power negotiations, power struggles, arguing with your kid, back to that top of that 3 R's, the reasoning, a lot of negotiation, you are really in a place that Susan calls the two lawyers, which she would also say means no one's in charge. No one's in charge because you're two lawyers going at it this way. If you look at that bottom one, which is the parent is below the child, that it's called the tyrant, or sometimes it's referred to as the dictator. And that is really where the child is in charge. They're really kind of running the show. Oh, that's what I was going to say. As you can probably tell, I lost my train of thought. I wanted to say, when parents ask that $1,000,000 question, a lot of times they say this, I've lost my ability to say no. I feel like I've lost my ability to say no because my child is struggling or they're in distress. Or when they do feel big emotions, they may say they miss their person and I don't know what to do with that. So you feel like your ability to say no, your ability to set rules and have limits and expect them to meet some expectations, it gets kind of undercut. And so when you've lost your ability to say no, we want to kind of support you to say, yeah, it is right for your kids. Back to that Erwin Sandler model, for you to be the captain of the ship, for there to be rules, for there to be limits and expectations. But just noticing where are you? And it may be that you're not always here, and that's okay. This is part of the work. You know, some of you said there's room for improvement. This is what we're aiming for, seeking to do. And as you can see, the parent's hand is at the top. The parent is in charge. It's the captain of the ship, being responsive in the ways we've already talked about. So this isn't about control. It's about captaining the ship, providing that structure that young people are needing. Okay, what about when we don't get it right? So some people said, wow, this feels overwhelming, and that's okay. Absolutely, there's a lot of info here. But you can see this is a bit, I loved this image because it shows these gears as moving together and also moving. This is an ongoing process. This is part of the process of building resiliency inside of a relationship. Stressors come from, you know, external things in our world, but they can also happen inside of our relationships, where you'll see over here, a trigger might happen in a relationship, not just from those other things that are part of, you know, when we think about the window, when we're tipping out, sometimes those are physiological things like hunger or tiredness or some of those. But, you know, they also may happen inside of our relationships, particularly with our kids. And so I love this, that we can return to the relationship with our child. We can work to repair. We acknowledge the feelings. Back to, remember that second R, the relating. You know, validating, acknowledging their experience, their feelings. I just love this piece here. So I'll let you kind of screenshot that or check in on that with yourself. Like, most families haven't had a lot of opportunities, I guess, to work with repair. It's just not something we talk about a lot. We can get it wrong and we can come back and we can repair. This is such a critical skill for lifelong relationships that are healthy. We all mess up, and you're going to model this for your kids. And you may find that some of that, the bad behavior, the blows that do come when they tip out of their window, this begins to turn at a more comfortable pace, where there might be ruptures, explosions, bad behavior on both of your parts, dysregulation. And you're able to become aware, notice that there's disconnection, and move toward repair. As we model that for our kids, they're able to begin to do it as well. So I'll give you an example. This was taught to me. One of the things I've done with my kids for several years now is I ask for a do-over. So that's my way into asking for repair. We've had a rupture. Maybe I've gone to one of those places on that spectrum that we talked about where I've lost control myself. So I'm not going to be able to relate back to the 3 R's. I'm not going to be able to enter in relating to them because they're closed off because right, I've triggered them probably with my anger, with my dysregulation. I've dysregulated them as well. We dysregulate each other. That's part of this attachment relationship. But when I become aware, my way into this is I say, I don't like the way that I did that. You know, I'll give you an example. My son came home from a friend's house who, I haven't asked permission to share this story. Okay, so I'll just say my son came home from a friend's house and I wasn't too sure about the whole deal. And so instead of just playing it cool and, you know, checking in on the night, I sort of dove right in. Like, what were you doing? You know, what did you guys do? Who was all there? I just did this grilling. And of course he kind of left the room pretty quickly. So I just went back to him and I said, you know, and he was mad also. He was really irritated at me. I said, can I have a do-over? Because I realized I don't want to approach it that way. When you come home from somewhere and I start grilling you, it must be so frustrating. And as I saw, it makes you want to walk away from me. But really, I just want to know you're safe. I want to know what you guys did tonight. Can I have a do-over? And now my kids, usually they'll say yes. And then I do it over. Like I actually literally do it over again. I re-ask the question. My kids do the same. My kids now do the same because we've done this enough together, this repair. I love this. It teaches the value of genuine repair, and it tells us that we can make mistakes without permanent damage, permanent rupture. And for some of us, hasn't been totally true in our relationships. So this is some work to move toward that. But finding a line that works for you to invite your child into repair after you've become aware. For me, it's, can I have a do-over? Okay, we have 10 minutes left. So if you are, you're waiting for the how-to, I do want to offer you that. I know that as a therapist, sometimes it can feel like we're a little too soft because parents will say something like, right, but you don't see them like when they're at home and it's really, really challenging. So let me say, I acknowledge that. I know that, right? Even though I'm asking you to look at your child through a different lens, and that is all still completely true, I recognize that there are also the realities of dysregulation that come out in unacceptable ways, that need limits, that need boundaries, okay, that need rules. So let's talk about that. Just wanted to come back to this. Here we are. I hope down here, like we haven't talked specifically, but we've touched on these places. We don't just want to slap on the rules. Those won't work. Those will create disconnection. But some of those other pieces we've talked about, when those are in play, there is definitely room for this. So when you're thinking about the rules, they may be changing in your family. So you want to pay attention to that. A question I ask if a parent is talking to me about a child being really defiant with a particular rule, especially, I'll say, is this a new rule? Like, has this rule always been here? Or is this a new rule? And like, why did you set it? Like, there might have been a really good reason why you chose this rule. Has that been communicated? And a lot of times it's an old rule that hasn't been enforced. And now we're seeing new things, particularly in grief. We want to help our child move toward well-being and health. And so we might start kind of cracking down on areas we didn't necessarily crack down on before, out of some of our worry or our focus on our child in a new way, in supporting them. So check in with that. Have the expectations been clear? Are these new rules? If they are, and you think they're needed, absolutely. But you need to communicate that. And also, what are the consequences going to be ahead of time? I personally find this is the work. You know, what are the consequences that are going to happen? And this part, consistent following through on them. Even when you are exhausted yourself, this is the hardest part to follow through. I think we all know this, right? But this is sometimes the hardest part. Maybe for me, maybe I'm just speaking for myself. Staying calm. Back to that regulation. These are critical parts of establishing healthy family rules. And then this last one, don't forget to catch them being good. I'm guilty of this. Don't know about you. Just always kind of picking on the thing that needs to change. I somehow think that's going to help, and it really doesn't. So part of that regulating and relating, and also helping them, even in the reasoning, to be more open to our feedback when we also have this balance of the positive reinforcement when letting them know they have met our expectations. It's a critical part. So actually this should probably be at the top, but catch them being good. Okay. So if you can tell, there's not too many slides on this, but I want to be real, because if you're working in those other areas, it's likely to be, it's less likely that you'll need to use some of these more intense limit setting things, but they do come up. You may need to, particularly if you have adolescents, right? Part of their stage of development is to sort of challenge authority, and find agency for their own life and find different values apart from their parents. And values are often a place of clash for teenagers and parents. And actually, we didn't have time for it today, but if you're thinking, where do I want to begin? Like, this is a lot. I would encourage you, I think there's a link somewhere in the slides, Sophie, if you have it, on values. Just grab yourself a cup of coffee, go to Starbucks, go to Timmy's, whatever. Check that link, because there's a really good starting place at the end. Think about your family values. What have they been prior to grief? What of those are going to carry forward? What of those are going to need to change? What of them do you want to change? And start there. What are my values for my family, for my kids? And that can help you decide what hills you're going to die on as well. Where are these places of limit setting that are actually important to helping these values come forward, come to fruition in our lives as a family and for my kids? So that will be different. We'd probably have a different values list for every person here. So there's no wrong way to do that. Encourage you to do that. But when your expectations are not being met for behavior, please, I hope what you've taken away is be curious first. How is my child's behavior? Remember that fiery ball coming to you. How is my child's behavior signaling to me an unmet need or a lagging skill they don't know how to navigate? Whether that's coming into touch with their emotions, like when are they being overwhelmed by emotion, or even some of those physical things we were talking about, like just being tired, being hungry, when it's time to put down your device, which can lead toward dysregulation. What are these behaviors signaling to me about a lagging skill and an unmet need that I can help support for my child? And then, we have 1 and 1, but how about 1 and 2? 1 and 2, choose the lowest level of consequences. Oh my word, this is killing me here. Okay, so think about levels of consequence. It should fit, Erwin Sandler says, punishment should fit the crime. Not a big fan of that language, but you might want to hold on to that. We want to make it fit. And sometimes we can do natural consequences. That's best when we can. Some kids are harder to motivate than others, though. So that's, I think, sometimes why I throw the kitchen sink when it comes to consequences, because I have one who's a little bit harder to motivate in that way. But when we can, we want to allow the consequences to happen naturally. The one that comes to the top of my head, you might want to have a little more compassion for when it comes to grief because of what's going on in grieving. But the one that came to my head was, okay, you repeatedly forget your homework. And so the natural consequence of that is you have nothing to submit. Not that I run it over to you every time you forget your homework. That makes sense. But, there's a lot going on in grief that may need a little extra support around that for a time. But you can kind of think about situations with your kids where a natural consequence fits. I find these are sometimes tricky. And so that's why there's these others. So we're going to, this is from the research from Erwin Sandler, that the discipline really, to be effective, because effective discipline is part of parenting a grieving teen, and that process of helping them adapt over time. If you remember, I said some of the core tasks of development, one of them is how to engage in the social world and peer relationships. And that does include limits and boundaries. And so you are teaching your kid how to move inside their window, but also how to react with other people in appropriate ways, including yourself. So the consequences should be unpleasant. And I think it's funny that it's here, but I just wanted to mention it because sometimes, if we send our kids to their room, but they have a TV and an Xbox, I don't know how unpleasant of a feeling that is. So I think I'm just confirming for you likely that these are all ways you can effectively discipline when you're doing all those other pieces we've talked about today. when you've started with self-reg, when you've been curious, where's the unmet need? Where's the lagging skill? And then, yeah, maybe we are needing some external structure and boundary. Remove or restrict privileges. I'm sure we've all done this. Might have to increase your supervision, time with your kids. Many parents of young kids say, it's a joke among friends, a lot of times my friends too, like, oh, if I take away their screen time, that's really punishment for me. So that's hard if time is limited for you anyway, and you're trying to find ways to refill yourself, but they may need more supervision. Maybe it's not you. Maybe coming back to that scale, it is other people in your village who can spend some time with them, offer some of that relating. The last one here is ignoring minor misbehavior. And so choosing what hill you're going to die on. We want to catch them being good. And we also don't have to point out every last thing they're doing wrong. So these minor misbehaviors, we might be letting them slide. Again, back to the values, you get to have your own. And so what that might look for you will look different for me. But, in my own world, I'm thinking I've had to let eye rolling slide. It's disrespectful. I hate it. But there's some other pieces that I'm going to hold to. I can't, if I'm going to pick everything, we're not going to be able to do a lot of relating because I'm always going to be correcting. And so choosing the values that you have, choosing what hills you want to die on, and sort of letting some of those other pieces go. Check in with yourself. I love this quote. There is a link from Dr. Stuart Shanker's work. There's a book he has about self-regulation versus self-control and why we've got to approach our parenting with that lens of self-reg, of identifying where our kids are struggling to regulate. What are those triggers that are coming in that tip them out of their window? And we also must be mindful of our own. A dysregulated parent cannot regulate a dysregulated child. You can't do it. You're actually sharing your dysregulation with them in our bodies. And so sometimes we do confuse our needs with our child's needs. And one of the things I hope you take out of this is that instead of just trying to manage their behavior, sometimes that's what we're doing with a lot of consequencing and punishment. Instead of just trying to manage their behavior, we want to teach them to self-manage. We want to equip them with these foundational skills that will go with them their whole life. So I hope that link is in there. That's a really great one. And there's I think the link is to an NPR episode. So if you're a podcaster, there's the script of it there, but also you can just listen to a conversation. And Dr. Shanker is Canadian, which is kind of cool. It's always fun. Okay, before I let you go, I do want to acknowledge that there may be times where this is feeling out of control, where the behavior that you're talking about feels like more than the things we're talking about today. So it doesn't mean those things don't apply. We still want to do them, but we want to check in on these things when we might notice we need more support. If the young person, there's extreme isolation, they're in a constant state of overwhelm, they can't return back to that window, right? And that might look like, might be sleep, it might be hyperactivity, and these are kind of off their baseline, but their arousal level, their physiological arousal, their emotional arousal, they are constantly in a state of overwhelm and not able to go into their window. Seek help for that. Just check in. What's going on here? What skills are lagging? What are the unmet needs? What else is needed? And if your kid feels way off their baseline I wrote prolonged, for a long time, grief's going to knock you off your baseline. Your window has shrunk. But we want to pay attention to how long this goes on. Is it a prolonged time and they're not able to shift? Significant poor school performance or attendance. These are things to check into. School's harder when kids are grieving. How long is this going on? And what kind of limits are needed around that? Danger, I wrote poor or dangerous ways of coping. And sometimes people just say drugs or alcohol, but I want to expand that. There's so many other ways that are even like socially acceptable to be coping in less than, healthy ways. Yes, of course, there's some of the dangerous, sexualized behaviors online, particularly drugs and alcohol. There can be, concerns around food and eating, self-harming, some of these pieces. We want to pay attention to those. Maybe there's some extra support needed to buffer up their skills to cope with intense emotion, because that's what's happening. They're not able, that's showing you they're not able to cope with the intensity of their experience. And then that last one, just when there is a breakdown in relationship, I hope the thing that you've heard throughout today is is that such a key vital part to resiliency and to resilient parenting. So when you do feel like you're doing these things and you've worked toward it, work toward, helping regulate and relate with your child, and that is it's just still not working, you might want to check in with, with us, with another supportive counselor around what's going on in this relationship where there's been the breakdown, because it's critical. And what I know from teens, I know they don't always show up like this, but they want it. They want relationship too. So where's the breakdown happening? The last resource I'd love Sophie to put in there before we let you go and check in with you about takeaways today, as I like throw all of this at you, is Ross Greene. I think if you remember at the very beginning, I had that slide that said, let's look at it from a different perspective, can't or won't. He has, so there's a link there for some like really concrete resources if you want to begin thinking, okay, sure, my kid lags in skills or they have unmet needs. How do I know what those are? There, you scroll down to the bottom of that link and there's some really good PDFs there that can help you begin to think about that. And really, when you think about lagging skills, so there's a list there. You don't have to generate this for yourself. There's a list there that helps guide you. And then you think, what is the problem that's coming out of these lagging skills? Might it be the bad behavior we're talking about? How do we address both of these things? So there's a link to that if that's something you're interested in. As we close, I feel like we will come back to this for our final session, a little bit more the practical, the how-to, specific to grieving parents. So I think that's it. As I said at the start, if you take anything away, I hope you take this away. Let's check in on takeaways before you go. You run out for your lunch hour is probably over. Sophie, will you throw those up there? Some things you might be, one thing you might be taking away, some of them, regulate, relate, reason. That's this triangle, upside down triangle about how to begin supporting your kid, even if you're just wanting to deal with behavior. Start with regulating. The rules are okay. They're actually even necessary, even for your grieving child. Full permission. Resiliency is not something you do have or you don't have. It can be built. I can captain the ship as we ride the waves of grief together. Yeah, this session. Okay, so some people have shared here that the session has forced them to practice self-regulation. We put that in there on purpose. There's a lot here. And it may feel like, man, I'm not doing it the way that I wanted to. I'm not doing it these ways. And so this is an invitation. This is a resource. And this is probably the most commonly asked question. What's behavior? What's grief? How do I support it? And as I shared with you, more that underlying question. And so thank you for sharing your takeaways. Okay, so as predicted, there's no Q&A time. We're out of time. But here, I want to leave you with this. You are the captain of your ship, your family's ship. And you can bring more crew on board. Sometimes the waves are really tough and you need some extra hands, but you got this. I hope these lunch and learns are part of that for you. When you feel overwhelmed, you can return to these lunch and learns and know also this community. You're not alone. And we are kind of here, hopefully as one of the hands on deck. Okay. I'm going to close us off. And I hope you all have a good day. It's freezing out there. And we will see you in 2 weeks, I believe. So we're going to start the developmental pieces around children 0 to 13, specific things you'll see in behavior and grief, and then adolescence after that. Okay, have a great day, everybody.